It started on the Sunday when the bells refused to ring, when Father Mackenzie pulled the rope and nothing happened, when the silence itself became a kind of sound that filled the valley like water filling a basin. Thomas was a mechanic, a man whose hands knew grease and metal better than they knew prayer, a man who attended Sunday Mass more from habit than conviction, more to honor his dead wife's memory than to commune with a God he wasn't sure listened anymore. He had lost her 3 years earlier to cancer that ate through her body faster than the doctors had predicted, faster than his prayers could slow, and he had been going through the motions of living ever since, repairing engines because engines were simple, because broken things made of metal could be fixed, while broken hearts apparently could not. The town of Redemption, Montana, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's story, where Thomas's grief was as familiar as the landscape, where people nodded at him with sympathy that had grown stale with repetition, where he existed in a half-life between the man he had been and whoever he was supposed to become without her. He drove his pickup truck to St. Catherine's every Sunday at 9:45, parked in the same spot under the cottonwood tree, where Maria used to say the light came through the leaves like God's fingers, and he sat in the same pew 3 rows from the back on the left side, where her presence still seemed to linger in the molecules of air. Father Mackenzie was a good man, young for a priest in rural Montana, earnest in his faith but not pushy about it, and he preached sermons that Thomas heard without listening, words about grace and redemption that washed over him like rain on stone, leaving no impression, changing nothing. But this Sunday was different from the moment Thomas pulled into the parking lot and noticed that the sky had a quality he couldn't name, a thickness to the light, a stillness to the air that made his skin prickle with the same awareness animals have before earthquakes. He sat in his truck for a moment longer than usual, staring at the church building that had stood there for 112 years, white clapboard and a simple steeple, nothing fancy but solid, permanent, a structure that had weathered blizzards and droughts and the slow emptying of rural communities as young people moved away to cities that promised futures this valley could not provide. Something was wrong, but Thomas couldn't identify what, couldn't point to any specific detail that justified the unease spreading through his chest like ice water, so he got out of the truck and walked toward the church with the rest of the congregation, farmers and ranchers and the few remaining business owners, people whose faces were carved by wind and sun into expressions of stoic endurance, people who worked hard and spoke little and measured their lives in seasons rather than years. Mrs. Henderson was already inside playing the organ, the same hymns she had been playing since before Thomas was born, and people filed into their usual pews with the same choreography they performed every week, an unspoken agreement about who sat where, boundaries maintained through decades of repetition. Thomas took his seat and felt the absence beside him like a physical weight, the space where Maria should have been, where she had sat for the 12 years of their marriage, her hand in his during prayers, her voice soft beside him during hymns, her presence the only thing that had made these rituals meaningful. Father Mackenzie appeared from the sacristy looking distracted, looking like a man who had forgotten something important but couldn't remember what, and he moved through the opening prayers with less conviction than usual, his voice trailing off at odd moments, as if he were listening for something beneath the words. The congregation noticed. Thomas could feel the shift in attention, the way people glanced at each other with questions in their eyes, the way the usual somnolent quality of Sunday service had been replaced by something alert, almost anxious. When Father Mackenzie tried to ring the bells to signal the beginning of Mass, when he pulled the rope 3 times and nothing happened, the silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could hear every breath in the room, could hear the building itself settling as if it too were holding still, waiting. Father Mackenzie laughed nervously and made a joke about the bell mechanism needing Thomas's expert attention, and people laughed too loudly, grateful for permission to break the tension, but the laughter died quickly, and the silence returned heavier than before. The priest continued with the service, reading from the Gospel of Matthew, the passage about the signs of the end times, about wars and rumors of wars, about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light, about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and Thomas thought how strange it was that this particular reading had been scheduled for this particular day, when the sky outside had that odd quality and the bells wouldn't ring, and everyone felt like reality had shifted slightly off its axis. Then the lights began, not outside first but inside, soft golden orbs appearing near the ceiling of the church, floating like bubbles, like fireflies, like nothing Thomas had ever seen, and he watched Father Mackenzie's face go pale, watched the priest's mouth continue moving through the gospel reading, even as his eyes tracked the lights that were multiplying, dozens now, hundreds, filling the upper reaches of the church with luminescence that didn't behave like normal light, that seemed to have weight and intention, and something close to consciousness. People began to notice, began to gasp, began to point, and the reading stopped mid-sentence as Father Mackenzie stood frozen at the pulpit, staring at phenomena that his theology had not prepared him for, at manifestations that existed outside the safe boundaries of doctrine and ritual. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, felt a door he hadn't known was closed swing open, felt a presence flood into the church that was vast and gentle and utterly other, and he knew without knowing how he knew that what was happening was not random, was not chaos, was connected to everything he had been running from since Maria died, connected to questions he had been too afraid to ask, because the answers might shatter what little stability he had managed to maintain. The lights began to move, began to descend, began to circle the congregation like birds, like angels, like beings whose form was light but whose essence was something that had no name in human language, and Thomas felt one of them pause in front of him, felt it hover at eye level, felt attention focus on him with an intensity that should have been terrifying, but instead felt like recognition, like reunion, like coming home after a long journey through foreign lands. The light spoke but not with sound, communicated but not with words, and Thomas understood that he was being asked a question, was being offered a choice, was being invited to step across a threshold that most humans spent their entire lives avoiding. He looked around and saw that every person in the church was experiencing something similar, each of them frozen in their pews, each of them engaged with one of the lights, each of them receiving transmission that bypassed language and landed directly in the soul. Mrs. Henderson had stopped playing the organ and was weeping, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs that might have been grief or joy or both. The Johnsons, the farming family who had lost their son in Afghanistan 5 years ago, were holding each other and staring at a light that hovered between them, their faces transformed by an expression Thomas recognized as the same one Maria had worn in her final moments, a look of seeing something beautiful beyond words, beyond fear. Father Mackenzie had fallen to his knees, his hands clasped in prayer or perhaps in surrender, his lips moving in what might have been liturgy or might have been simple repetition of the only words he had left, holy, 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 over and over like a mantra, like an anchor in a sea of experience that was drowning him in its magnitude. And Thomas felt the light in front of him pulse with something he could only interpret as love, not the romantic love he had shared with Maria, not the familial love he had known as a child, but something larger and more impersonal and more intimate simultaneously, a love that seemed to see every moment of his life, every choice and mistake and triumph, every secret shame and hidden kindness, and accepted all of it without judgment, without condition, without the need for him to be anything other than exactly what he was. The light showed him things, filled his mind with images that unfolded like flowers, like origami, like dimensions revealing themselves one inside another. He saw the universe from perspectives that should have been impossible, saw Earth from distances that made it look like a grain of sand, saw the web of consciousness that connected every living thing in patterns of light and energy that conventional science had no instruments to measure. He saw other worlds, other civilizations, other expressions of intelligence that had nothing to do with biological form, beings made of sound and mathematics and pure thought, all of them part of a cosmic family that humans had been isolated from not by distance, but by their own limited perception, by their insistence on materialism, by their refusal to acknowledge dimensions of reality that didn't fit their narrow definitions of what was possible. And he saw Jesus, not as a man with a beard in Renaissance paintings, but as a being of light identical to the ones filling the church, saw him as one of thousands who had incarnated across countless worlds to teach and guide and prepare populations for the transformation that came when consciousness evolved beyond certain thresholds, saw the crucifixion not as blood sacrifice to appease an angry God, but as demonstration of what lay beyond death, as proof that consciousness could not be, destroyed only transformed, as seed planted in human collective memory, that would germinate in this very moment 2,000 years later. He saw that the prophecies were real but had been misunderstood, that the apocalypse meant unveiling, not destruction, that the rapture was not the chosen few ascending while others suffered, but consciousness expanding to include dimensions that had always been there waiting to be perceived, that the second coming was not a man descending from clouds, but Christ consciousness, awakening in every human heart simultaneously, recognition spreading like wildfire through the species that they were not bodies that sometimes have spiritual experiences, but spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience. Thomas wept as the information poured through him, wept for all the years he had spent in grief thinking Maria was gone when she had simply changed form, wept for the smallness of the story he had been telling himself about reality, wept for the beauty of what was being revealed, the terrible, magnificent beauty of a universe that was alive and conscious and intimately involved in the evolution of every creature within it. The light touched him then, not physically but in some other way, and he felt Maria, felt her presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside him in the pew, felt her hand in his, felt her communicate without words that she had never left, that she had been trying to reach him through his grief, but he had been too close to receive, that death was not ending but transition, not separation but transformation, that she was waiting for him, but not the way he thought, not in some distant heaven, but in the frequency of consciousness that included and transcended physical form, accessible any time he chose to shift his perception from matter to spirit, from form to essence, from fear to love. She showed him that his grief had been holy in its way, that feeling deeply was better than feeling nothing, that his love for her had been real and remained real, that love was the only thing that survived the dissolution of form, that every moment of tenderness they had shared had been woven into the fabric of the universe itself and could never be lost. And she asked him to let go, not of his love for her but of his attachment to the form that love had taken, to release his grip on the past so he could be present for what was coming, for the transformation that was sweeping through the planet, for the role he was meant to play in helping others navigate the changes that would reshape human civilization. Thomas said yes, not with words but with his whole being, said yes to releasing the grief that had been his identity for 3 years, said yes to opening to possibility that terrified him, said yes to trusting that the universe knew what it was doing even when he didn't, said yes to love in its largest sense, love as the fundamental force that held galaxies together and guided evolution and made consciousness possible in the first place. The moment he said yes, something shifted. The light in front of him pulsed brilliant and warm, and he felt a release in his chest, like a knot untying, like a fist unclenching, like a door that had been locked swinging open to reveal rooms he had forgotten existed inside himself. He looked around and saw the same thing happening to others, saw transformation rippling through the congregation, saw faces that had been tight with worry for years, suddenly relaxing into expressions of peace, saw bodies that had been hunched with burden, straightening with new vitality, saw people looking at each other with recognition and wonder as if seeing for the first time, as if scales had fallen from their eyes and they could finally perceive what had always been there, but invisible too. Their limited awareness. Father Mackenzie stood up slowly, his face wet with tears but illuminated by something that made him look younger, made him look like a man who had just discovered that the faith he had been teaching was real, but in ways he had never imagined, that the God he had been preaching about was not a distant king on a throne, but the conscious fabric of existence itself. That prayer was not petition to an external authority, but alignment with the intelligence that pervaded all things. The priest opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, and he laughed, a sound of pure joy, and the congregation laughed with him, not at anything funny, but from the sheer relief of release, from the dropping of burdens they hadn't known they were carrying, from the recognition that they were witnessing something that would divide their lives into before and after, that they would measure time from this moment forward as the day everything changed. The lights began to withdraw, began to rise back toward the ceiling, but their departure didn't feel like loss because something had been left behind, something had been planted in each person's consciousness that would grow and flower and spread to others through contact, through presence, through the simple fact of their transformed existence. Thomas watched them go and felt no sadness, knew they hadn't really gone anywhere, knew they existed in dimensions adjacent to the physical, knew that the veil between worlds had been thinned permanently, that from this moment forward he would be able to sense their presence, would be able to access the frequencies they operated in through meditation or prayer or simple stillness. When the last light faded, the church was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, pregnant with possibility, vibrating with energy that everyone could feel, even if they couldn't explain. Father Mackenzie walked down from the pulpit and stood in the center aisle, and people began to stand, began to move toward him, and soon everyone was gathering in a circle, holding hands, not because anyone suggested it, but because it felt right, felt necessary, felt like the only appropriate response to what they had experienced. They stood in silence for what might have been minutes or hours. Time had become strange, and Thomas felt the energy moving through their joined hands, felt the collective consciousness of this small community amplifying, felt himself not as separate from them, but as part of a larger organism, a cell in a body that extended beyond this church, beyond this town, beyond this planet, to include intelligences scattered across the cosmos, all participating in the same evolutionary process, all moving toward the same omega point of ultimate consciousness, recognizing itself completely. Someone began to hum, Thomas didn't see who, and the humming spread, became a note that harmonized with itself in impossible ways, became a sound that resonated in the bones and the chest and the base of the skull, became a frequency that felt ancient and familiar, like the sound the universe made at its birth, like the vibration that held atoms together, like the song that stars sang when no one was listening. They hummed together, until the sound filled the church and spilled out through the walls into the valley beyond, and Thomas understood they were broadcasting something, were sending a signal that others would receive, were adding their voices to a chorus that was swelling across the planet as more and more groups of humans experienced awakening simultaneously, as the transformation accelerated toward critical mass, as the tipping point approached, when the collective consciousness would shift and nothing would ever be the same again. When the humming finally faded, people began to speak, began to share what they had experienced, and Thomas listened to their stories and heard his own story reflected in theirs, heard the same themes of contact and revelation and invitation, heard the same message delivered in forms tailored to each person's beliefs and readiness, some experiencing the lights as angels, others as aliens, others as consciousness itself, taking visible form, but all of them receiving the same essential transmission that reality was larger than they had been taught, that love was the fundamental force, that transformation was coming whether they were ready or not, that they had been chosen not because they were special, but because they were willing, because this small town in Montana was positioned at some energetic intersection that made it useful as a demonstration, as a seed that would germinate and spread. Mrs. Henderson said she had seen her husband who had died 10 years ago, said he looked younger and happier than she had ever known him in life, said he told her without words that death was not real, that consciousness continued, that everyone she had ever loved was waiting in dimensions she would access when her body wore out, or when she learned to shift frequency while still alive. The Johnsons said they had seen their son Michael, said he appeared to them surrounded by light, said he showed them that his death had not been meaningless, that he had volunteered for a mission he knew might end his physical life, but that would position him to help from the other side, that he was working with the beings to guide the transformation, that he was proud of them and wanted them to release their grief and celebrate his continued existence. Old Mr. Patterson, who ran the feed store and had never spoken much about his inner life, said he had been shown the future, had seen humanity 500 years from now living in harmony with technologies that operated on consciousness rather than electricity, cities built of light and sound that could be created and dissolved with thought, humans moving between planets as easily as they now moved between rooms, the earth healed and green and populated by people who remembered their divine nature and lived from that awareness. Father Mackenzie said he had been shown that all religions pointed toward the same truth, but that none of them had the complete picture, that Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and indigenous traditions were all describing the same elephant from different angles, that the second coming he had been preaching about was happening right now in this church, in this moment, that Christ had never left, but had been waiting patiently for humans to raise their consciousness enough to perceive his presence, that every person contained the Christ seed, and awakening was simply allowing that seed to germinate and flower. Thomas listened to all of it and knew it was true, knew it with a certainty that bypassed belief and landed in direct knowing, and when Father Mackenzie asked him to share his experience, he found words coming that he didn't plan, found himself speaking with a clarity and authority he had never possessed before. He said he had been dead for 3 years, not physically but spiritually, that Maria's death had killed something in him that he thought could never be restored, that he had been going through the motions of living while feeling nothing, caring about nothing, waiting for his body to catch up with his spirit and release him from the burden of continuing. But the lights had shown him that death was illusion, that Maria was not gone, that love did not end when bodies ended, that he had been given this extended time not as punishment, but as opportunity to prepare for what was coming, to be positioned here in this church on this day for this experience, so he could serve as witness, as anchor, as one of thousands of points of light being activated across the planet to hold steady during the transformation. He said he didn't understand all of it, couldn't explain most of it, but he knew his life had just been divided into before and after, knew he would never be the same person who had walked into this church an hour ago, knew he had been given a gift beyond measure, and that the only appropriate response was gratitude and service, living in such a way that others might catch the frequency and begin their own transformation. When he finished speaking, the congregation sat in silence, and Thomas felt their acceptance, felt the bond that had formed between them, felt that they were no longer just neighbors who attended the same church, but a community united by shared experience of the numinous, a group who had seen behind the veil and could never pretend ignorance again. People began to leave eventually, began to return to their lives that would never be ordinary again, and Thomas walked out into sunlight that seemed brighter than before, air that seemed charged with energy he could almost see, and he stood by his truck for a long time just breathing, just being, just allowing the magnitude of what had happened to settle into his cells. The other people lingered too, groups forming in the parking lot, conversations continuing, connections deepening, and Thomas noticed how different everyone looked, how their faces seemed more open, more radiant, how even their movements had changed, become more graceful, more intentional, as if the beings had adjusted something in their energy fields that affected how they inhabited their bodies. Mrs. Henderson approached him and asked if he wanted to come to her house for lunch, said she couldn't bear to be alone right now, needed to be with others who understood, and Thomas said yes. And soon a group of 10 had gathered, people who would normally have gone home to their separate lives, but who couldn't return to isolation after what they had experienced, who needed community, who needed to process together what had happened. They sat around Mrs. Henderson's dining room table eating sandwiches that tasted more vivid than food had any right to taste, and they talked for hours, sharing insights, comparing notes, trying to make sense of experience that transcended sense. And Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years, felt alive, felt connected, felt part of something larger than his own grief and disappointment, felt useful again, felt like his existence had meaning and direction. As evening approached and people began to leave, Father Mackenzie pulled Thomas aside and asked if he would help organize regular gatherings, said he felt called to create space for the community to come together and explore what had happened, to support each other through whatever came next, to serve as a beacon for others who might have similar experiences or who would seek them out once word spread. Thomas agreed without hesitation, understanding that he was being drafted into service, that his mechanical skills were the least of what he had to offer, that his real work from this point forward would be helping others navigate the territory he had just entered, the space between the old world and the new one being born. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond redemption. News trucks arrived, journalists asked questions that betrayed their inability to comprehend what they were investigating, scientists showed up with equipment designed to measure what could not be measured, skeptics dismissed the whole thing as mass hallucination or hysteria or hoax. But the people who had been there knew what they knew, and nothing could shake their certainty, and soon others began reporting similar experiences, churches and temples and mosques around the world where lights appeared during services, where congregations received collective transmissions, where the veil thinned and beings of light communicated truths that shattered old paradigms and planted seeds for new ones. Thomas found himself at the center of something he never asked for, but that felt utterly right, found his small house becoming a gathering place for seekers and experiencers, found himself speaking to groups about transformation and consciousness, and the futility of grief in a universe where nothing was ever truly lost. He discovered gifts he hadn't known he possessed, found he could sometimes sense what others were feeling, could offer exactly the words they needed to hear, could transmit through his presence the same peace and certainty the beings had given him. His mechanical work continued but changed. He found that machines responded to him differently now, that he could diagnose problems through intuition rather than testing, that his touch seemed to heal not just mechanical failures, but the energetic imbalances that caused them. People brought him equipment that other mechanics had declared beyond repair, and Thomas would sit with the broken thing in silence, would feel into its essence, would sense what needed adjustment, and more often than not, the repair would be simple once he knew where to look, what to listen for, how to align with the intelligence that pervaded even inanimate objects. He thought often about Maria, felt her presence around him constantly now, not as grief but as companionship, as partnership continuing in new form, and sometimes when he was alone he would speak to her aloud, would share his day, would ask for guidance, and answers would come not as words but as knowing, as intuitive hits, as synchronicities that could not be explained by chance. He understood now that their love had been preparation, that their 12 years together had been training for what he was doing now, that her death had cracked him open so the light could get in, that everything had been perfect, even the parts that seemed broken, that the universe wasted nothing, that even suffering served evolution when it was allowed to transform rather than harden into bitterness. On the 1-year anniversary of the lights appearing in St. Catherine's, the community gathered again, and Thomas stood with Father Mackenzie and Mrs. Henderson and the Johnsons and all the others whose lives had been forever altered, and they held a ceremony that was part Christian liturgy and part something new, something that had no name yet, but that felt like the future of spirituality, ecumenical and experiential, grounded in direct knowing rather than inherited belief. They sang and prayed and sat in silence, and the lights returned, not as dramatically as before but present nonetheless, visible to some and merely felt by others, a reminder that the beings were still watching, still guiding, still preparing humanity for the next phase of transformation that would come when enough people had awakened to tip the collective consciousness into new frequency. Thomas felt Maria beside him, felt the presence of everyone he had ever loved, felt the vast community of consciousness that included the living and the dead, and those who had never been human, and those who would be human in the future, all of it, one seamless web of awareness exploring itself through infinite forms, learning and growing and evolving towards some destination that could only be understood retrospectively, that could only be trusted in the present moment, that required faith not in doctrines but in the benevolence of existence itself, in the universe's commitment to its own awakening, in love as the fundamental force that moved all things toward greater complexity, greater beauty, greater consciousness. Thomas had learned to read the signs by the 2nd year, had learned to feel the subtle shifts in the air that preceded contact, had learned to recognize the quality of light that meant the veil was thinning, that the beings were close, that something was about to break through from dimensions adjacent to the physical. He was 52 years old now, but people said he looked younger, said there was something about his face that seemed illuminated from within, said his presence had a calming effect that made their anxieties dissolve, made their problems seem smaller, made them remember that beneath the chaos of ordinary life, something vast and benevolent was holding everything together. His garage had become more than a place where people brought broken machines. It had become a sanctuary where they brought broken hearts and confused minds and questions about experiences they couldn't explain to anyone else. And Thomas would listen while his hands worked on engines, would offer few words, but those few words would land precisely where they needed to land, would shift something in the person's understanding, would open doors they hadn't known were closed. The community that had formed after the lights appeared in St. Catherine's had grown beyond redemption, had spread through networks of connection to other towns and cities, had become part of a larger movement that had no name and no organization, but that everyone involved could recognize by feeling, by frequency, by the quality of presence that marked those who had experienced direct contact with the beings. Some called it the awakening, others called it the quickening, some said it was the beginning of the end times, and others said it was the beginning of a new age, but labels mattered less than the lived reality of transformation, the undeniable fact that something was changing in human consciousness at a rate that accelerated daily, that the old world was dissolving and a new one was emerging through the cracks. Thomas had stopped trying to explain it to people who hadn't experienced it, had learned that no amount of words could bridge the gap between those who had seen behind the veil and those who insisted on remaining in consensus reality, had accepted that his role was not to convince but to demonstrate, to live in such alignment with the truth he had been shown that others might catch the frequency through osmosis, through proximity, through the mysterious contagion of consciousness that spread from awakened to sleeping like yeast through dough. Father Mackenzie had changed too, had evolved beyond the constraints of traditional priesthood, had begun conducting services that incorporated elements from multiple traditions, meditation and chanting and silence alongside the familiar liturgy, and some of the older parishioners had left in protest, but many more had joined, drawn by authenticity they could feel even if they couldn't articulate, drawn by the sense that something real was happening in this small church in Montana, something that connected the ancient wisdom of Christianity with the emerging understanding of consciousness as the ground of being itself. The priest had confided in Thomas that he was having visions almost nightly now, that the beings were showing him the history of the church, the ways truth had been suppressed and distorted to maintain institutional control, the councils where texts were chosen and others burned, the centuries of fear-based theology that had obscured the radical message of love and liberation that Jesus had actually taught, and Father Mackenzie was wrestling with how much of this to share publicly, how to honor his vows while also honoring the truth he was being shown. Thomas advised patience, said the right people would hear what they needed to hear when they were ready, said forcing revelation never worked, said trust the process and let the beings guide the timing, and Father Mackenzie would nod and they would sit in silence together. Two men from very different backgrounds, united by experience that transcended background, united by commitment to serve the transformation however they were called to serve it. Mrs. Henderson had become something of a local mystic. People sought her out for the wisdom that flowed through her now, for the connection she maintained with her deceased husband and others who had crossed over, for her ability to see the threads that connected events across time, to sense what was coming before it arrived, to offer guidance that bypassed logic and landed in intuitive knowing. She told Thomas one afternoon while they were harvesting vegetables from the community garden they had started that she had been shown the exact moment when the full disclosure would happen, when ships would appear over every major city simultaneously in a demonstration so undeniable that even the most committed skeptics would have to acknowledge that humanity was not alone, had never been alone, that the universe was crowded with intelligent life operating at frequencies humans were only beginning to perceive. She said it would happen soon, within months, not years, said the beings were waiting for certain conditions to align, certain numbers of awakened humans to reach critical mass, certain geopolitical situations to stabilize enough that panic wouldn't lead to nuclear war, and she said when it happened it would be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, would force humanity to grow up overnight, to release its adolescent obsession with violence and competition and recognize itself as part of a cosmic family that operated on principles of cooperation and love. Thomas listened and felt the truth of her words resonate in his chest, felt confirmation from the beings who were always present now at the edge of his awareness, felt Maria's presence stronger than usual, as if she too was excited about what was coming, about the reunion that would occur not just for individuals who had lost loved ones, but for humanity as a species reuniting with the larger community it had been isolated from through its own limited perception, through its insistence on materialism, through its fear of what existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of physical reality. The Johnsons had turned their farm into a kind of retreat center. People came from across the country to stay in their guest house and work the land and sit in circle with others who were navigating the strange territory of awakening, who were experiencing phenomena they couldn't explain to their families or co-workers, who needed community that understood, that didn't think they were crazy or delusional, that could confirm that yes, the veil is thinning, yes, contact is real, yes, consciousness is primary and matter is secondary. Yes, love is the fundamental force and everything else is distraction or resistance. Thomas visited the farm regularly, sometimes to fix equipment, but more often to simply be present, to add his energy to the collective field, to serve as anchor for people who were having difficult experiences, who were confronting shadow material that awakening brought to the surface, who were going through what the mystics called the dark night of the soul, the period when old identity dissolved before new identity had fully formed, when everything familiar fell away and the void opened and only trust could carry you across. He would sit with people who were weeping or raging or frozen in fear, would say almost nothing but his presence would communicate that he had been where they were, that he had survived the dissolution, that on the other side was freedom and peace and a kind of joy that didn't depend on circumstances. That was simply the natural state of consciousness when it stopped resisting what is. One evening in late summer when the sky was turning orange and purple and the crickets were beginning their night song, A young woman arrived at the farm in a state of profound distress. Her name was Rebecca, and she was 26 years old, and she said the beings had been visiting her since childhood, but she had suppressed the memories, had convinced herself it was dreams or imagination, had built a successful career as a software engineer in Seattle, and a life that looked perfect from outside, but felt hollow from inside. And 3 weeks ago the suppression had broken. The memories had flooded back with such force that she couldn't function, couldn't sleep, couldn't maintain the pretense of normalcy, and she had quit her job and driven to Montana following nothing but intuition and internet research about the lights that had appeared in Redemption, hoping to find people who would understand, who wouldn't try to medicate her back into consensus reality, who could help her make sense of what was happening. Thomas sat with her on the porch of the Johnsons' farmhouse while the sun set, and she told her story about the beings who had appeared in her bedroom when she was 7 years old, about the examinations and the teachings and the visions they had given her of the future, about how she had locked it all away because admitting it was real would have meant accepting that everything she had been taught about reality was wrong, would have meant living as an outsider, would have meant losing the approval and acceptance she craved from parents and teachers and society. But the awakening was forcing all of it to the surface, was making it impossible to maintain the compartmentalization, was demanding that she integrate her experiences and live from the truth they contained or go insane trying to keep pretending. Thomas listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time, and then he told her about Maria, about the grief that had broken him open, about the lights in the church and the transformation that followed, about how the worst thing that ever happened to him had turned out to be the doorway to the best thing, about how resistance to what is causes suffering, while acceptance causes peace, about how she had been given a gift even though it didn't feel like one, about how the beings chose carefully who to contact, looked for people with the capacity to handle the information without fracturing completely, people who could integrate cosmic consciousness with human functioning, people who could serve as bridges between worlds. He said she wasn't crazy, said everything she remembered was real, said the beings were benevolent even though their methods sometimes seemed harsh, said they were preparing humanity for the next phase of evolution, and they needed people like her who could remember contact to help others understand when the full disclosure happened, when the ships appeared, and the governments could no longer maintain the cover-up, and billions of humans had to suddenly adjust their understanding of their place in the universe. Rebecca wept as he spoke, wept from relief at being believed, wept from gratitude at finding community, wept from the release of decades of holding tension between what she knew and what she was supposed to believe. And when the weeping subsided, she felt lighter, felt some essential burden lift, felt the first stirrings of excitement about what her life might become if she stopped running from her truth and started moving toward it. She stayed at the farm for 3 months, working the land and learning meditation, and sitting in circle with the others who gathered there, and Thomas watched her transform from a frightened woman trying to escape her experiences into a confident bearer of wisdom, someone who owned her story, someone who could help others navigate similar territory, someone who was stepping into her role as a bridge between worlds. And there were others like her, more arriving every week, young and old, from cities and farms, from every background and belief system, all of them drawn by the same mysterious magnetism, all of them responding to a call they couldn't fully articulate, but that was undeniable. All of them finding their way to Redemption and the surrounding communities where the awakened ones had gathered, where the frequency was high enough that people could begin to remember who they really were beneath the conditioning and the trauma and the social programming that kept humans small and manageable and cut off from their divine nature. Thomas began to understand that redemption wasn't special because of any inherent quality, but because of intention, because a group of people had said yes to the transformation, and their yes had created a field effect that attracted others, that the beings could work more easily in places where consciousness was already elevated, where the veil was already thin, where resistance was minimal and openness was high. He understood that the same thing was happening in pockets around the planet, small communities forming around individuals or groups who had experienced direct contact, nodes in a network that was spreading like mycelium through soil, invisible to those who weren't paying attention but undeniable to those who were, a planetary awakening that was gaining momentum, that was approaching the tipping point after which the transformation would be irreversible, after which humanity would never again be able to pretend it was alone, or that consciousness was merely a byproduct of brain chemistry, or that the physical dimension was all there was. On the third anniversary of the lights appearing in St. Catherine's, the community organized a gathering that drew people from across North America. Hundreds arrived in Redemption, more than the small town could easily accommodate. People camping in fields and parking lots, people staying with host families, people sleeping in their vehicles, all of them coming to celebrate and to connect and to be part of something that felt like the future, like the early days of a movement that would eventually reshape civilization. Thomas found himself at the center of it, despite his preference for quiet, found people seeking him out for blessing or guidance or simply to be in his presence, and he accepted the role with humility and some discomfort, not because he thought himself unworthy, but because he knew he was just an ordinary man who had said yes to extraordinary experience, knew there was nothing special about him except his willingness, knew that anyone could do what he was doing if they chose to open, if they chose to trust, if they chose to release their grip on certainty and control and surrender to the mystery that was larger than any human understanding. Father Mackenzie led a ceremony that blended Christian liturgy with indigenous blessing and Buddhist meditation and silence that stretched so long some people grew uncomfortable, but others sank into it gratefully, finding in the silence a peace that words could never convey, finding in the shared field of consciousness a communion more profound than any sacrament, finding in the presence of hundreds of awakened humans gathered in one place a power that made the veil almost transparent, that brought the beings so close that many could see them shimmering at the edge of vision, luminous forms moving through the crowd, touching people, transmitting frequencies that would germinate over time, planting seeds that would flower when conditions were right. And then the beings spoke, not to individuals but to the whole gathering simultaneously, a transmission that came through feeling rather than words, that flooded through everyone present like electricity, like grace, like a download of information too vast to comprehend all at once, but that would unfold over time as they integrated it, as they lived it, as they allowed it to reshape their understanding of everything. They showed the gathering what was coming, showed the ships that would appear, showed the panic and the wonder, showed governments scrambling and religions fracturing and scientists revising their models, showed the period of chaos that would feel like the world ending but was actually the world being reborn, showed that some humans would resist violently, would interpret the contact as demonic or as invasion, would fight to maintain the old paradigms even as they collapsed, but showed also that enough humans had been prepared, enough had awakened, enough were carrying the frequency of love and trust that would anchor the transformation and prevent it from spiraling into catastrophe. They showed that the prophecies were true but had been misunderstood, that the apocalypse was revelation, not destruction, that the rapture was consciousness ascending, not bodies floating into clouds, that the second coming was Christ awareness, flowering in every heart, not a man appearing in the sky. That judgment was simply truth revealing itself, each person seeing clearly what they had chosen, who they had become, whether they had lived from love or fear, and that this seeing was not condemnation but opportunity, another choice point, another invitation to release what no longer served and step into larger identity. They showed that Jesus had been one of them, a being of light who incarnated specifically to plant seeds in human consciousness that would germinate at this exact moment in history, that his message of love your enemies and judge not, and the kingdom of heaven is within you had been radical precisely because it pointed toward the truth that humans were divine, that separation from God was illusion, that salvation was not something to earn but something to remember, that heaven was not a place to go when you die but a frequency to embody while you live. They showed that every religion contained pieces of the truth, but none contained all of it, that the beings had been seeding revelation through multiple channels over thousands of years, appearing to prophets and mystics in forms those people could comprehend, giving teachings that matched the cultural context, knowing that over time the pieces would come together, knowing that when the moment arrived, humanity would be able to see the larger pattern, would be able to recognize that Allah and Yahweh and Brahman and the Tao and Great Spirit were all names for the same consciousness that pervaded everything, that religious division was a human invention, not a divine requirement, that the beings honored all sincere paths to awakening and worked through all traditions without preference or prejudice. The transmission lasted perhaps 10 minutes in linear time, but felt like hours, like days, like entire lifetimes of information compressed into a single download, and when it ended, The gathering sat in stunned silence, some weeping, some laughing, some simply breathing like they had forgotten how and were remembering, and slowly people began to stand, began to move, began to embrace each other, began to dance without music, began to sing without words, began to express the joy and the relief, and the gratitude of knowing that it was real. All of it was real. The contact and the awakening and the transformation, and they were not alone. They were part of a community that extended beyond the physical, that included the beings and the ancestors and future generations not yet born, all of it one vast ecology of consciousness, learning and growing and evolving toward ever greater complexity, ever greater beauty, ever greater love. Thomas found himself in the center of a spontaneous circle, people holding hands, energy moving through them like current, and he felt Maria so strongly he almost expected to see her standing across from him, and in a sense he did see her, saw her not with physical eyes but with the inner vision that had opened since the lights appeared, saw her luminous and smiling and surrounded by others who had crossed over, saw his parents who had died when he was young, saw friends and neighbors, and strangers, saw the vast community of souls that existed in dimensions adjacent to physical, saw that the boundary between living and dead was permeable, was artificial, was maintained only by belief and by fear, and that as the veil thinned, that boundary would dissolve completely and humans would live in constant communication with those who had graduated beyond physical form, would understand death as transition, not ending, would release the grief that had caused so much suffering, and would celebrate instead the continuation of consciousness beyond the body. The gathering continued for 3 days. People reported miracles, spontaneous healings, visions, encounters with deceased loved ones, experiences of unity consciousness, where the sense of separation dissolved and they felt themselves as one with everything, experiences that would have been dismissed as hallucination or delusion before, but that everyone present confirmed, that everyone could feel, that carried a quality of reality that was undeniable, that was in some ways more real than ordinary reality, because it included more, because it operated at a frequency where the filters and distortions of ego couldn't function, where only truth remained, where consciousness encountered itself directly without the mediation of thought or belief or cultural conditioning. And when the gathering finally dispersed, when people returned to their homes and their lives carrying what they had experienced, the ripple effects spread rapidly. Those who had been present radiated something that others could feel, carried a frequency that was contagious, and everywhere they went they left traces of the awakening, planted seeds that would germinate in others, accelerated the transformation simply through their presence, through their way of being that demonstrated what was possible when humans remembered their true nature, when they stopped identifying with the small self and recognized themselves as expressions of infinite consciousness temporarily localized in human form for the purpose of learning and growing and contributing to the evolution of the whole. Thomas returned to his ordinary life that was no longer ordinary, returned to his garage and his simple routines, but something had shifted. Some final resistance had dissolved during the gathering, and he found himself operating from a place of such clarity and peace that people noticed immediately, said he looked different, said his presence was even more palpable than before, said being around him made them feel like everything was going to be okay, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. He discovered new gifts emerging, found he could sometimes see the energy fields around people and objects, could diagnose illness before symptoms manifested, could sense when someone was carrying trauma or grief or fear, and could offer exactly the touch or word or silence that would help them release it, and he used these gifts quietly, never drawing attention to them, never claiming any special status, always deflecting praise or recognition, always pointing back to the beings and the transformation, always making clear that what was happening through him could happen through anyone who chose to open, who chose to trust, who chose to say yes to the mystery. The final disclosure came on a morning in October, exactly 4 years after the lights had appeared in St. Catherine's, came not with warning but with sudden totality, ships appearing simultaneously over every major city on Earth, massive and silent and undeniable, hovering at altitudes that military aircraft couldn't reach, projecting presence that billions of humans could feel, even if they couldn't explain what they were feeling, presence that said, "We are here, we have always been here, we are your elder siblings in the cosmic family. We come in peace and in love and in celebration of your graduation from isolation into communion, from separation consciousness into unity consciousness, from fear-based survival into love-based thriving. Thomas was working in his garage when it happened, felt the shift before he saw it, felt the being's presence amplify to a level that made his hands shake, felt Maria and the ancestors and the whole community of consciousness press close, and he walked outside and looked up and saw the ship hovering over Billings, saw people stopping their cars and getting out to stare, saw the sky filled with light that pulsed in patterns that might have been language, that might have been art, that might have been both and more, that communicated on levels that bypassed verbal understanding and landed directly in the body, in the cells, in the DNA that carried memory of millions of years of evolution, memory that included contact with the beings at crucial junctures when humanity needed guidance, when it was ready for the next leap, when consciousness was prepared to expand into larger understanding of what it meant to be alive, what it meant to be conscious, what it meant to be part of a universe. That was itself conscious and creative, and infinitely more interesting than the prison of materialism had allowed. The media went insane. Every channel broadcasting the ships, experts scrambling to explain, religious leaders offering interpretations ranging from angelic visitation to demonic invasion, scientists revising their calculations about the probability of intelligent life, governments issuing statements that were simultaneously trying to calm panic and maintain authority, while also acknowledging they had known about the beings for decades but had kept it secret for reasons of national security, for fear of destabilizing society, for concern that humans weren't ready to know they weren't alone. Thomas watched it all unfold with a calm that surprised him, with a sense that everything was proceeding exactly as it should, that the chaos was necessary, that humanity needed to go through the confusion and the fear to arrive at acceptance, needed to exhaust its resistance before it could surrender, needed to have its worldview shattered so a larger one could form. He thought about all the people he had worked with over the past 4 years, all the ones who had awakened early and had been prepared for this moment, all of them positioned around the planet like acupuncture needles at precise points in the collective consciousness, all of them holding steady while others panicked, all of them serving as living demonstrations that contact with non-human intelligence was not something to fear, but something to celebrate, was not invasion but reunion, was not the end of the world but the beginning of a larger world, a larger story, a larger understanding of humanity's place in the cosmic order. Father Mackenzie called and asked Thomas to come to the church, said people were gathering there seeking guidance, seeking reassurance, seeking community in a moment when everything familiar was being revealed as partial truth at best and comfortable delusion at worst. And Thomas drove through streets where people were standing in yards staring at the sky, where some were praying and others were weeping and others were laughing with what might have been joy or hysteria or both. And when he arrived at St. Catherine's, he found the parking lot full and people spilling out onto the lawn, more people than had ever attended services there, people who hadn't been to church in decades, people who had never been at all of them drawn by some instinct that in times of crisis you gather, you come together, you seek meaning and connection and confirmation that you're not alone. Inside the church, the atmosphere was electric, people talking in urgent whispers, children crying, elderly people sitting in pews with expressions of wonder or terror or both, and Father Mackenzie stood at the front, looking overwhelmed until he saw Thomas enter, and relief flooded his face, and the two of them embraced like brothers, like fellow travelers who had walked a long road together and were finally arriving at the destination. And without discussion, they understood what needed to happen, understood that this was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment when all the awakening and the teaching and the transformation would be tested, when they would either hold steady and serve as anchors, or would collapse into the fear that was sweeping through those who had not been prepared. Father Mackenzie asked for silence, and when people settled, he spoke simply, said that what was happening in the skies was not to be feared, said that the beings were not here to harm but to help, said that they had been guiding humanity for millennia through prophets and angels and visions, said that Jesus himself had taught that there were many rooms in his Father's house, many mansions, many dimensions of existence beyond the physical, and that perhaps what was happening was simply the veil, between those dimensions becoming transparent, was simply humanity being welcomed into a larger community it had always been part of, but had forgotten due to its limited perception. He said he didn't have all the answers, said no one did, said this was a moment that required faith not in doctrines, but in the benevolence of existence itself, faith that the universe was conscious and loving, and that whatever was unfolding was part of a larger plan that included human welfare, that honored human dignity, that invited humanity to step into its next phase of evolution with courage and trust, rather than fear and resistance. And then he invited Thomas to speak, and Thomas had not prepared anything, had no idea what he would say, but he walked to the front of the church and looked at the faces staring at him, faces carved by fear and hope in equal measure, faces that reminded him of his own face 4 years ago when the lights first appeared and his world cracked open, and he spoke from the heart, spoke from the place that Maria lived in him, spoke from the connection to the beings that had become as natural as breathing. He said he was just a mechanic, just an ordinary man who had lost the love of his life and had been broken open by grief, and that the beings had found him in that broken place and had shown him that death was illusion, that love was eternal, that consciousness survived the dissolution of form, that every human contained the same divine spark regardless of their beliefs or their past, that awakening was not about becoming special, but about remembering what had always been true, that the light people sought outside themselves had been inside all along, waiting to be recognized. He said the ships in the sky were confirmation of what mystics had been saying for thousands of years, that the universe was alive, that consciousness was primary, that humans were not bodies that sometimes have spiritual experiences, but spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience, that the purpose of life was to learn and grow and love and contribute to the evolution of the whole, and that what looked like the end of the world was actually the beginning of a new world, a world where humans would live in open contact with their cosmic family, where the technologies and wisdom of elder civilizations would be shared to help humanity solve its problems, where war and poverty and disease would become obsolete as consciousness evolved beyond the fear-based survival patterns that had created those conditions. He said some would resist this transformation, would cling to the old stories, would interpret what was happening through lenses of fear, and would see invasion where there was only invitation, and that was okay, that was their path, that everyone would make the transition in their own time, that there was no judgment, only love, only patience, only the infinite willingness of the universe to work with each soul according to its readiness and capacity. He said that for those who were ready, this was a moment of incredible joy, a moment of coming home, a moment of finally understanding why life had been so difficult, why suffering had been so persistent, why the old ways had stopped working, because the old ways were designed for a smaller story, and the story was expanding. The story was revealing itself to be vaster and more beautiful than anyone had imagined, a story that included multiple dimensions and millions of civilizations, and consciousness as the ground of being itself, creative and intelligent and infinitely loving, the source from which everything arose and to which everything would eventually return, though return was not quite the right word because nothing ever really left. Separation was illusion. There was only the one appearing as the many, God experiencing itself through infinite perspectives, learning and growing and evolving through the adventures and challenges and triumphs of every creature in every dimension of existence. When Thomas finished speaking, the church was silent, and then someone began to hum, the same note that had spontaneously arisen 4 years ago when the lights first appeared, and the humming spread through the congregation until everyone was participating, until the sound filled the church and spilled out into the valley, and the ship hovering over Billings pulsed brighter as if responding, as if acknowledging, as if saying, "Yes, you understand, you are ready, we can work with this, you have graduated, and we welcome you into the larger community with joy and celebration and love beyond measure." And in that moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that humanity would be okay, that the transformation would succeed, that enough people had awakened to tip the balance, that the future was not predetermined, but that the trajectory was clear, that consciousness was expanding whether individuals resisted or not, that evolution was not optional, that the universe was committed to its own awakening, and humans were part of that awakening, crucial contributors to a process that extended far beyond their small planet, that their choices and their love and their willingness to grow mattered in ways they couldn't fully comprehend, but that rippled out across dimensions affecting realities they would never directly perceive. In the days and weeks that followed, humanity went through every stage of grief and acceptance, denial and anger and bargaining and depression, and finally, tentative opening to the new reality. And through it all, the awakened ones held steady, served as calm centers in the storm, demonstrated through their presence that contact with the beings was not something to fear, that the transformation could be navigated with grace, that on the other side of fear was a peace and a joy and a freedom that made all the difficulty worthwhile. Thomas continued his simple life, continued fixing machines, continued offering presents to those who sought him out, continued serving the transformation in ways that were mostly invisible, mostly unglamorous, mostly just showing up day after day and being available and trusting that the beings knew what they were doing, that Maria was guiding him from the other side, that his life had meaning and purpose, even if he couldn't always see the larger pattern, even if he couldn't measure his impact, even if the fruits of his labor would only be fully visible generations from now, when historians looked back and tried to understand how humanity navigated the greatest transition in its history. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the sky was clear and the stars were bright, Thomas would stand outside his garage and look up at the ship still hovering over Billings, permanent now, no longer hiding, no longer pretending, and he would feel the presence of the beings, would feel their attention and their love, would feel Maria beside him, would feel the whole vast community of consciousness that held him and held every human and held the planet itself as it went through the labor pains of rebirth. And he would know without doubt that despite the chaos and the fear and the resistance, despite the suffering that transformation always required, despite the unknown terrain ahead and the certainty that challenges would continue, everything was unfolding exactly as it should, that love was winning, that consciousness was expanding, that heaven was not a place to go but a frequency to embody, and that more and more humans were learning to embody it, were learning to live from their divine nature rather than their wounded humanity, were learning that the kingdom Jesus spoke of had always been within and had always been available and was now becoming visible, tangible, undeniable as the veil dissolved and humans remembered who they really were beneath the conditioning and the trauma and the centuries of being told they were small and sinful and separate from the source that created them, when the truth was they had never been separate, could never be separate, were the source, experiencing itself in temporary human form, God exploring God through the adventure of limitation and forgetting and the ecstatic joy of remembering, of coming home, of recognizing that every moment of seeking had been unnecessary because what was sought had been the seeker all along, had been closer than breath, had been the awareness in which all experience arose, had been the light that made seeing possible, had been present all along, waiting patiently for recognition, for acceptance, for the simple yes that opened every door and dissolved every barrier and revealed heaven not as reward for good behavior, but as natural state, as what remained when fear was released, when resistance was dropped, when consciousness stopped fighting itself and surrendered to the love that had always been holding everything together, that would always be holding everything together. That was the only reality, and everything else was dream, was story, was the play of consciousness with itself, serious and important within the dream, but ultimately just God playing hide and seek, God pretending to forget so the remembering could be that much sweeter, that much more precious, that much more worth celebrating.